The lawyer slid the papers across the polished mahogany table and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully under the proposed agreement, 70% of the marital assets would be transferred to your husband. Across from me, Richard folded his hands over his stomach like a king waiting for tribute. And beside him, Melissa, my daughter-in-law, the widow of my dead son, the woman I had treated like family for nearly 20 years. She wouldn't even look me in the eye. I remember noticing the bracelet on her wrist first. Thin gold chain, tiny diamonds, expensive. Richard must have bought it recently because I'd never seen it before. My husband had never remembered our anniversary without help from a calendar. But apparently adultery had improved his memory. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Outside the attorney's office window downtown, Columbus traffic crawled through wet October streets, while rain streaked the glass. Richard's lawyer kept talking. Something about fairness. Something about Richard's financial contributions. Something about reaching a peaceful settlement at our age. I stopped listening. Because at that exact moment I realized something almost funny. They truly believed I was the weakest person in the room. I looked down at the papers. Then I smiled. And for the first time since my son died, my husband looked nervous. 3 months earlier, I still believed my life was ordinary. Not perfect, not exciting, just ordinary in the quiet way long marriages become ordinary after 43 years. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 67 years old when I learned 2 painful truths almost at the same time. First, grief can hollow out a family so slowly you barely notice it happening. Second, betrayal rarely arrives all at once. It leaks in through tiny cracks. The first crack appeared after my son Daniel died. He was 42, high school history teacher, loved old blues records and terrible chili dogs from roadside diners. He died on Interstate 71 during freezing rain when a pickup truck crossed the median. One moment your child exists. The next moment a state trooper is standing on your porch removing his hat. People say parents aren't supposed to bury their children. They're right. Part of me never came back from that funeral. Melissa didn't come back either. At first I understood her grief. God help me, I truly did. She and Daniel had been married almost 15 years. They had a little girl together, our granddaughter Sophie, who was only 6 when her father died. Melissa cried constantly those first months. So did I. I helped however I could. I cooked meals. Paid utility bills when Melissa fell behind. Watched Sophie after school. Even dipped into my retirement savings to help Melissa keep her mortgage current during the first terrible year. Richard agreed at first. At least outwardly. But grief changed him differently than it changed me. I became quieter. He became selfish. Retirement had already been difficult for Richard before Daniel died. He'd owned a small construction company most of his life, and once the business was sold, he drifted around the house restless and irritated. After Daniel's funeral, something hardened inside him. He started complaining about money constantly. "Do you know what groceries cost now?" he'd mutter while staring at receipts. Or, "We can't keep bailing people out forever, Evelyn." People. That's how he referred to our son's widow and granddaughter. Still, I ignored the warning signs because that's what women my age were trained to do. Keep the peace. Endure quietly. Protect the family image. And honestly, I was tired. Grief ages you. By the second year after Daniel's death, Melissa started coming over more often. At first it seemed natural. She'd bring Sophie for dinner, sit in the kitchen drinking tea while I cooked. Sometimes she stayed late talking with Richard in the living room while I cleaned dishes. Looking back now, I wonder when the line was crossed. Was it gradual? A touch lingering too long? Shared complaints about me? Late-night phone calls? I'll never know. But I do remember the first moment my instincts whispered that something was wrong. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring. I'd gone to Kroger for groceries and forgotten my coupon envelope at home. I came back 20 minutes earlier than expected. As soon as I walked inside, I noticed Melissa's scarf hanging near the staircase banister. I remember smiling at first because Sophie wasn't there, which meant Melissa must have stopped by just to visit. Then I heard laughter upstairs. Low laughter. Private laughter. I froze. Our bedroom door upstairs wasn't fully closed. I took 2 steps up the staircase. That's all. Then I heard Melissa say softly, You promised me once this is done we won't have to hide anymore. My entire body went cold. Richard answered her in that stupid low voice older men use when they think they sound younger. Baby, you'll never struggle again. Baby. Not Melissa. Not sweetheart. Baby. I stood there gripping the railing so hard my fingers cramped. People imagine betrayal arrives with screaming. It doesn't always. Sometimes it arrives silently, like your body shutting down to protect itself. I backed down the stairs one careful step at a time, grabbed my purse and walked back outside before either of them saw me. I sat in my Buick for nearly 40 minutes in the grocery store parking lot staring at the steering wheel. Not crying. Not yet. Mostly thinking about Daniel. Because there are betrayals against a spouse. And then there are betrayals against the dead. That night I pretended nothing had happened. I cooked pot roast. Melissa sat at my table eating my food while talking about Sophie's spelling test. Richard asked for extra gravy. I watched both of them carefully. The ease between them suddenly looked obscene. Tiny things became obvious once I knew. Shared glances. Private smiles. The way Melissa touched his arm while laughing. I felt like I was watching strangers wear my family's faces. Later that night, Richard fell asleep in his recliner downstairs. I went into his office looking for answers. What I found instead changed everything. His laptop sat open beside several financial folders. Richard had never been careful with paperwork. For 40 years I'd handled most of our bookkeeping anyway. At first I only intended to confirm my suspicions about the affair. Instead I found emails from divorce attorneys, draft settlement proposals, retirement account summaries, and one document highlighted in yellow, proposed asset distribution, 70% to Richard Carter. My stomach dropped. Then I saw something else. Transfer attempts. Large ones. Money quietly moved from joint savings into separate accounts over the previous 8 months. I photographed everything with my phone. Every page. Every account number. Every signature. And while standing alone in that dark office, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling helpless. Because for the first time in months, my grief made room for something else. Anger. Cold, patient anger. Richard and Melissa thought I was broken. Old. Distracted. Too heartbroken to notice what they were doing behind my back. They were wrong. And before I finally went upstairs to bed, I looked at one of those divorce documents again. And smiled. The strange thing about betrayal is how quickly it changes the meaning of old memories. After I discovered the affair, I started replaying 43 years of marriage in my head like old home movies with missing pieces. Moments that once looked ordinary suddenly looked suspicious. Richard buying new cologne at 70 years old. Melissa defending him every time he snapped at me. The sudden password on his phone after decades of leaving it on the kitchen counter. Even the way he started criticizing my appearance that last year. You should really start dressing nicer, he'd said once while watching television. At the time I blamed retirement boredom. Now I understood. A man rarely notices his wife aging until he's trying to impress someone younger. The morning after I found the documents, I woke before sunrise and sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of weak coffee. Outside, April rain tapped softly against the windows above the sink. Richard came downstairs around 7 wearing sweatpants and that faded Ohio State sweatshirt he'd owned for at least 15 years. He looked at me carefully. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said. He grunted and reached for the coffee pot. I studied him while he poured his cup. 70 years old, slight stoop in his shoulders now, gray hair thinning at the crown, reading glasses hanging from the neck of his sweatshirt. This was the same man who held my hand when Daniel was born. The same man who cried when we dropped our son off at college. The same man who promised me after my breast cancer scare 12 years earlier that we'd grow old together no matter what happened. And somehow he'd become a stranger sitting 3 feet away from me, asking if we needed more coffee filters. That realization hurt worse than the affair itself. Because affairs are selfish. But becoming emotionally invisible to someone after 40 years together, that's its own kind of cruelty. Richard left later that morning to meet friends for breakfast. I waited exactly 10 minutes before going back into his office. This time I looked deeper. I found printed emails between Richard and a divorce attorney named Howard Sutter. Most of the language was dry legal nonsense, but certain phrases stood out immediately. She has limited understanding of our financial structures. She'll likely agree to avoid conflict. We should move quickly before she becomes emotional. I read that last sentence 3 times. Before she becomes emotional. I almost laughed. Men like Richard always mistake calm women for weak women. They never understand how dangerous silence can become. I kept digging. That's when I found Melissa's messages. Not romantic ones. Financial ones. Questions about the lake house. Questions about retirement accounts. Questions about whether the house title issue would affect future ownership. Future ownership. She was already planning her life after replacing me. I printed every email carefully. Then I drove downtown Columbus to meet the only person I trusted enough to tell the truth. Patricia Moreno had been my best friend since 1978. We met working administrative jobs at the same insurance office when our boys were still in elementary school. Patricia was 68 now, widowed, sharp-tongued, and impossible to intimidate. When I walked into her condo carrying that folder full of documents, she took one look at my face and said quietly, "What did he do?" I sat at her dining room table and told her everything. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just plainly. The affair. The divorce plan. Melissa. The money transfers. Patricia listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she removed her glasses slowly. That son of a bitch. Hearing someone else say it out loud nearly broke me. I finally cried then. Not loud crying. The exhausted kind older women do quietly into paper napkins after there's nobody left to impress. Patricia came around the table and hugged me hard. "You listen to me," she said firmly. "You are not going to let those 2 parasites destroy your life." That afternoon she gave me the number for Linda Garvey. Best divorce attorney in Franklin County, Patricia said. Mean as a snake when she needs to be. 2 days later I met Linda in a modest brick office near German Village. She was 59, silver blonde hair, navy blazer, no wedding ring. The kind of woman who noticed everything. She reviewed my documents silently for almost 20 minutes while I sat across from her twisting tissues in my lap. Finally she looked up. "Mrs. Carter," she said carefully, "did your husband ever explain inheritance laws to you?" Number. A faint smile touched her face. Good. That was the moment the ground shifted beneath my feet. For nearly 2 hours, Linda walked me through our finances piece by piece. Not Richard's version. The truth. The farmland outside Newark that my father left me before our marriage, legally mine. The investment account originally opened with proceeds from selling that farmland years later, mostly traceable to separate inheritance funds. The lake house Richard bragged about constantly purchased partially through inherited money connected to my side of the family. Even parts of Richard's old construction business had been stabilized decades earlier, using collateral tied to assets I inherited. I stared at Linda in disbelief. "You're telling me most of this was never really his?" "I'm telling you," she said calmly, "your husband spent 40 years benefiting from your financial stability, while convincing himself he created everything alone." I sat speechless. All these years, Richard handled the public image of success, while I quietly managed the practical survival underneath it. And somehow even I had started believing the myth. Linda continued reviewing papers. Then her expression darkened. "These transfers concern me." She pointed toward several withdrawals Richard made during the previous year. "He's moving marital funds while preparing for divorce. Judges don't like that." "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Linda leaned back in her chair. "Now we stop reacting emotionally and start preparing strategically." For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt something unfamiliar. Control. Not revenge exactly. Not yet. Just clarity. Over the next several weeks, I became an actress inside my own marriage. I played the grieving older wife perfectly. Confused sometimes. Forgetful occasionally. Quiet almost always. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Phone records. Bank statements. Screenshots. Receipts. Even photographs. Especially photographs. Melissa kept coming to the house. Sometimes with Sophie. Sometimes alone. The worst part wasn't the affair anymore. It was watching how comfortably they lied. Melissa still hugged me goodbye. Still thanked me for dinners. Still called me Mom occasionally. One evening, she sat at my kitchen table discussing Sophie's school fundraiser, while Richard watched her with that soft expression he hadn't given me in years. And suddenly I realized something awful. They weren't ashamed. Not really. They pitied me. In their minds, I was simply the old wife standing in the way of their future happiness. That understanding changed everything inside me. Because pity is sometimes more insulting than hatred. A month later, Richard officially asked for the divorce. He did it over meatloaf. I just think he said carefully while avoiding my eyes at our age, maybe we deserve peace. Peace. Such a polite word for betrayal. I nodded slowly and took another bite of dinner. Then I looked at my husband, the man who thought I knew nothing, and said softly, "If that's what you want, Richard, I won't fight you." The relief on his face told me exactly how badly he was about to underestimate me. Once Richard officially asked for the divorce, the atmosphere inside our home changed almost overnight. Not loudly. That would have been easier. Instead, the house became painfully polite. We spoke like co-workers trapped in the same office after an ugly disagreement nobody wanted to mention directly. "Did you feed the dog?" "There's soup in the fridge." "Your doctor appointment is Thursday." 43 years of marriage reduced to refrigerator notes and weather updates. And somehow that quietness hurt more than screaming would have. Richard moved into the downstairs guest bedroom 2 weeks after the conversation, as he called it. Not our son's death. Not his affair. Not the destruction of our family. Just the conversation. Meanwhile, Melissa started appearing at the house more frequently than ever. At first, I thought maybe guilt was pushing her there. I was wrong. It was entitlement. One Saturday afternoon, she stood in my kitchen drinking flavored coffee from my favorite mug, while casually discussing renovations she thought the lake house needed. "The cabinets are really outdated," she said, "and honestly, the upstairs bathroom should probably be redone completely." I kept peeling potatoes at the sink. "That sounds expensive." Richard answered before she could. "Well, once everything's settled, we'll finally have flexibility." Flexibility. The man talked about my lifetime savings the way people discuss vacation coupons. I glanced toward Melissa. She avoided my eyes and kept stirring artificial sweetener into her coffee. That was becoming her specialty. Avoiding my eyes. I started noticing how carefully she managed guilt. Never openly cruel. Never openly affectionate with Richard in front of me. Just small assumptions. Small claims. Small acts of replacement. One evening she folded laundry in my living room like she already lived there. Another time she corrected Sophie when the child called me before asking Melissa something. "Ask your grandmother later, sweetheart," Melissa said gently. "She's tired." "Your grandmother?" "Not Grandma Evelyn." "Not Mom." The title suddenly sounded distant. Temporary. That night, I sat alone on the back porch listening to cicadas while anger settled deeper into my bones. Not explosive anger. Cold anger. The kind older women learn after decades of swallowing disappointments quietly. The thing people misunderstand about women my age is this: we are not fragile because we speak softly. We simply learned long ago that emotional control is power. And I intended to use every ounce of mine. Linda certainly encouraged it. Over the next month, she and I met regularly downtown. Each meeting revealed another ugly detail. Richard wasn't just planning divorce. He was planning erasure. He intended to keep the lake house. Most retirement investments. A majority of our liquid savings. And according to several emails Linda obtained during discovery preparations, Melissa was heavily involved in those discussions. One message made my stomach turn. Melissa had written, "Once Evelyn signs, we can finally start living our real life." Our real life. I printed that email myself. Then I cried in Linda's office bathroom for nearly 10 minutes. Not because of the marriage anymore. Because of Daniel. Every betrayal somehow circled back to him. My son had loved that woman. Trusted her. Built a family with her. And now she was helping his father dismantle the rest of us piece by piece. A week later, I drove alone to Green Lawn Cemetery to visit Daniel's grave. Ohio spring had finally turned warm, and tiny yellow flowers had started blooming near the older headstones. I brought fresh white carnations because they'd been his favorite. I sat beside the grave for nearly an hour, talking quietly. That probably sounds strange to some people. But parents who lose children understand. You never really stop speaking to them. I'm sorry, I whispered finally. Wind moved softly through the trees overhead. I should have protected Sophie better. My granddaughter. That little girl had become the only thing anchoring me emotionally through all of this. She was 9 now, smart, sensitive, too observant for her own good. Children always know more than adults think. One Friday evening I picked Sophie up from school because Melissa claimed she had appointments. We stopped for ice cream afterward at a small diner Daniel used to love. Sophie sat across from me in a blue soccer sweatshirt, swinging her feet beneath the booth. Halfway through her sundae, she asked innocently, "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Are Grandpa Richard and Mommy getting married?" The spoon slipped from my hand and clattered against the bowl. I forced a smile. "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged. "They already act married." My chest tightened painfully. Children always know. Always. I kept my voice gentle. "What do you mean?" "Well," she licked chocolate ice cream from her spoon. "When we went to Indianapolis for Grandpa's business thing, they slept in the same hotel room." I couldn't breathe for a moment. Not because I didn't already know about the affair, but because suddenly I understood how reckless they'd become. How selfish. How little they cared about protecting even Sophie from the ugliness. "When was that?" I asked carefully. "Last summer." Last summer. Meaning while Melissa still sat at my table pretending grief over Daniel. Meaning while Richard still kissed my forehead goodnight. Meaning while I was helping pay Sophie's school expenses. I excused myself to the restroom before Sophie could see tears forming in my eyes. Inside the diner bathroom, I gripped the sink and stared at my reflection. Older woman. Gray roots showing. Tired eyes. But something else too. Resolve. When I returned to the booth, Sophie smiled nervously. Did I say something bad? I sat beside her instead of across from her. Then I wrapped my arm gently around her shoulders. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong." But inside something permanent shifted. Until then, my pain centered mostly on betrayal. Now it became protection. Because whatever happened next, I would not allow those two selfish adults to poison Sophie's life any further. A few days later, Linda finalized our legal strategy. We sat in her office surrounded by folders stacked across the conference table. She pointed calmly at several highlighted documents. "Your husband made one critical mistake," she said. "What's that?" "He assumed you'd stay emotional instead of becoming organized." For the first time in months, I laughed. A real laugh. Small but real. Linda smiled too. Then she slid the final settlement meeting date across the table toward me. 3 weeks away. Richard still believed he'd already won. Melissa probably did too. And I realized something almost amusing as I drove home that afternoon beneath bright Ohio sunlight. Neither one of them had any idea what was waiting at that conference table. The morning of the settlement meeting, I woke before dawn. For a few quiet minutes, I simply lay in bed listening to the old house settle around me. Pipes creaked softly inside the walls. Rain tapped against the gutters outside. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator hummed steadily in the dark kitchen. 43 years earlier, Richard and I moved into that house with borrowed furniture and exactly $300 in our checking account. Now we were preparing to divide the remains of an entire lifetime. Funny how quickly a marriage becomes paperwork. I dressed carefully that morning. Nothing dramatic. Cream-colored sweater, navy slacks, small pearl earrings Daniel bought me years ago for Mother's Day. I even took extra time fixing my hair. Not for Richard. For myself. Because after months of humiliation, I wanted to walk into that office looking like a woman who still respected herself. When I came downstairs, Richard was already in the kitchen drinking coffee. He looked nervous for the first time in weeks. Not visibly nervous. But I knew him well enough to recognize the signs. Tapping fingers. Short responses. Avoiding eye contact. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." He nodded stiffly. Then after a long silence, he said something almost laughable. "We can still keep this civil, Evelyn." Civil. As if he hadn't slept with our dead son's widow. As if he hadn't spent months quietly moving money behind my back. As if Melissa hadn't practically started measuring curtains for my replacement. I picked up my purse calmly. "Of course," I said. The drive downtown felt strangely peaceful. Columbus streets glistened from overnight rain while radio hosts talked about college football and rising grocery prices. Ordinary life continuing while mine quietly collapsed. Richard drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. I stared out the passenger window and thought about Daniel. About Sophie. About all the years I'd spent minimizing myself to preserve everyone else's comfort. Never again. The law office occupied the 7th floor of a modern building overlooking Broad Street. Everything inside smelled expensive. Fresh coffee, leather chairs, lemon furniture polish. Richard's attorney, Howard Sutter, greeted us near reception with a salesman's smile that instantly irritated me. "Good morning, folks." Folks? Like we were discussing property taxes instead of betrayal. Melissa arrived 10 minutes later. She walked into the conference room wearing a pale beige dress and carrying a designer handbag I recognized immediately. I bought that bag. Not directly, of course. But our shared money had. She looked beautiful in the careful, polished way women do when they desperately want to appear composed. But her eyes betrayed her. She looked tired. Anxious. Good. For months I had carried the anxiety alone. Now it was their turn. She sat beside Richard without touching him. Still pretending. Still hiding behind manners. I almost admired the commitment. Linda arrived last. Sharp navy suit, thick legal folders tucked beneath one arm. When she sat beside me, she leaned over slightly and whispered, "Just breathe, let them talk first." Then the performance began. Howard spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing proposed asset distribution. He used phrases like equitable division and marital contributions and retirement stability. Mostly legal language designed to confuse and intimidate. Finally, he slid the papers toward me. Under this proposal, he said smoothly, 70% of the marital assets would be transferred to Mr. Carter. There it was. The number. The greed. Richard kept his face carefully neutral, but I noticed Melissa glance toward him quickly. Tiny nervous excitement. Like gamblers waiting for cards to turn over. I lowered my eyes to the paperwork. The numbers were absurd. The arrogance almost impressed me. They truly believed I would sign quietly. That I'd panic. Cry. Beg. Instead I smiled. Just slightly. But it was enough. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Howard cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter." I looked up calmly. "I have a few questions first." Linda opened her folder. And suddenly the entire atmosphere inside the room changed. What happened next unfolded slowly. Painfully slowly. Which made it even better. Linda began with the retirement transfers. Calm voice. Precise documentation. Dates, amounts, account numbers. Howard's confident smile faded almost immediately. Then came the inheritance records. Property deeds. Investment tracing. The farmland my father left me decades earlier. The proceeds connected to later investments. The lake house funding structure. Every carefully hidden detail Richard assumed I'd never understand. Melissa's face lost color first. Richard looked confused. Then irritated. Then frightened. Linda slid another stack of documents across the table. These records indicate the majority of several disputed assets originated from Mrs. Carter's inherited property. Howard frowned. That's not consistent with what my client represented. No, Linda replied calmly, it isn't. Richard finally snapped. What the hell is this? Linda didn't even look at him. This, she said, is accurate financial tracing. I watched realization slowly crawl across his face. For 40 years, Richard handled public business negotiations, while I quietly handled taxes, bookkeeping records, debt management, and investments behind the scenes. And because I never demanded credit for it, he eventually convinced himself I contributed nothing. Melissa spoke for the first time. But the lake house. Linda turned toward her sharply. The lake house was partially purchased using inherited funds belonging solely to Mrs. Carter. Melissa blinked rapidly. Richard looked stunned. And then came the part I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Linda opened the final folder. Additionally, she said evenly, we have documentation of substantial financial transfers conducted during the affair relationship between Mr. Carter and Mrs. Daniels. Melissa visibly flinched at the word affair. Richard's jaw tightened. Howard removed his glasses slowly. "You didn't disclose this to me," he said quietly to Richard. Nobody answered. Linda continued mercilessly. "Luxury purchases, hotel charges, private account transfers, even jewelry purchases, including the bracelet Melissa wore on her wrist at that very moment." I watched her instinctively cover it with her sleeve. Suddenly, nobody looked confident anymore. The room grew painfully quiet. Then Richard exploded. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, "after everything I built." "You built," Linda interrupted calmly. That single sentence silenced him. Because the truth finally stood naked in front of everyone. Richard hadn't built nearly as much alone as he liked pretending. He simply married a woman who spent 40 years quietly holding everything together. And now that woman was done protecting him from consequences. Melissa pushed her chair back first. "I need some air." Her voice shook badly. She grabbed her purse and hurried out of the conference room without looking at either of us. Richard stared after her in disbelief. That may have hurt him more than the legal documents. Not the money. Abandonment. Interesting how quickly affairs collapse once fantasy meets paperwork. Finally, Richard turned toward me. For the first time in months, the arrogance was gone. "Evelyn." I met his eyes calmly. And after everything they'd done, everything they'd taken, everything they'd destroyed, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Just clarity. Because revenge at my age stops being about punishment. It becomes about refusing to disappear. Affairs always look glamorous in secret. That's the part nobody talks about, honestly. Hidden hotel rooms feel exciting. Stolen text messages feel romantic. Late-night promises sound believable in the dark. But eventually morning arrives. Bills arrive. Lawyers arrive. Reality arrives. And reality is where most fantasy dies. 3 weeks after the settlement meeting, Richard moved into a small condominium on the northwest side of Columbus near Bethel Road. Not because he wanted to. Because it was what he could actually afford. The lake house was no longer an option. Most of the investment accounts were protected. And after legal fees, tax penalties, and the exposure of his hidden transfers, Richard suddenly discovered he was not the wealthy king he imagined himself to be. Funny how quickly arrogance shrinks inside a one-bedroom condo with beige carpet and fluorescent kitchen lighting. I only saw the place once. He asked me to stop by because he needed to discuss paperwork. In truth, I think he just didn't want to be alone. The condo smelled faintly of microwave dinners and air freshener. A television played loudly in the background even though he wasn't watching it. That struck me hardest. Men like Richard spend their entire lives terrified of silence. He looked older already. Not physically exactly. Emotionally. Like the fantasy had drained color out of him. "Thanks for coming," he muttered awkwardly. I sat carefully in a stiff dining chair near the window. The room contained almost nothing personal. No family photographs. No warmth. Just temporary furniture and unopened moving boxes. "How's Sophie?" he asked. Confused. He nodded without meeting my eyes. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then finally he said the thing I'd been expecting for weeks. "Melissa's under a lot of stress." There it was. Not remorse. Not accountability. An explanation. I folded my hands calmly. "So am I." He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You don't understand how complicated this became." I almost laughed. Complicated. As though he'd accidentally wandered into an affair with his daughter-in-law. As though betrayal were some unfortunate weather condition nobody caused. "No, Richard," I said quietly. "I understand perfectly." That conversation ended quickly after that. Because once illusion disappears, there isn't much left to say. Melissa, meanwhile, changed faster than Richard did. The confidence vanished first. Then the entitlement. Then the romance. I started hearing things through mutual friends without even trying. Arguments in public. Money problems. Melissa upset Richard couldn't follow through on the future he promised. Apparently the two of them fought constantly about housing finances and Sophie. Good. Not because I enjoyed their suffering. At least not entirely. But because consequences matter. Especially for people who destroy others while convincing themselves they deserve happiness more. Still, the person suffering most wasn't Richard. And it wasn't Melissa. It was Sophie. Children absorb emotional chaos the way walls absorb cigarette smoke. Quietly. Permanently. By late summer, Sophie had become withdrawn at school. Her teacher called me one afternoon expressing concern. "She seems anxious lately," she said gently, "very distracted." That night, Sophie sat beside me on the back porch while fireflies blinked across the yard. She leaned against my arm silently for a long time before speaking. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart." "Did I do something bad?" My heart nearly broke. I turned toward her immediately. "Why would you think that?" "Because everybody keeps leaving." I pulled her into my arms so quickly the porch chair creaked beneath us. "Oh, baby," I whispered. That was the moment I stopped focusing on revenge completely. Not because Richard deserved forgiveness, and certainly not because Melissa deserved comfort, but because bitterness is dangerous when children are watching. Sophie needed stability more than I needed anger. So I began rebuilding life around simpler things. Church on Sundays. Volunteering twice a week at the local library. Gardening again. Cooking proper dinners instead of eating toast over the sink while crying. Little by little, the house started feeling like mine instead of a battlefield. And strangely enough, peace began returning in small, ordinary moments. Morning coffee. Folded laundry. Late summer rain. The sound of Sophie laughing during old sitcom reruns. Healing at our age rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly. Melissa came to see me in early September. Alone. I almost didn't open the door when I saw her standing on the porch. She looked exhausted. No makeup. Hair pulled back carelessly. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, she looked her actual age instead of desperately younger. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Part of me wanted to refuse immediately. Another part remembered Daniel loved this woman once. So I stepped aside. She sat at my kitchen table, twisting tissues between trembling fingers while I made coffee neither of us drank. Finally, she whispered, "I think I ruined my life." I stayed silent. Because honestly, she had. Tears filled her eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. There's something almost astonishing about hearing adults describe betrayal like an unexpected accident. "When exactly did you think sleeping with your father-in-law would end?" I asked calmly. She flinched hard. Good. For several moments she simply cried quietly. Then the truth finally started emerging in pieces. After Daniel died, Melissa became terrified. Not just lonely. Terrified. Of bills. Of raising Sophie alone. Of growing older without security. Richard started helping more. Calling more. Listening more. And eventually that emotional dependency twisted into something uglier. I kept telling myself it was love, she whispered, but honestly, I think I was just scared. That sentence stayed with me. Because fear makes people selfish in ways they later barely recognize. Still, fear doesn't erase responsibility. "You betrayed Daniel," I said softly, "and you betrayed Sophie." Fresh tears rolled down her face. I know. For the first time I believed she truly did know. Not enough to undo it, but enough to finally suffer honestly. Then came the sentence I never expected. "He said you'd be fine financially no matter what happened." There it was again. The assumption. The justification. The quiet belief that older women somehow stop being fully human once they become useful providers. I looked directly at her. "You both thought I was already halfway gone." Melissa started crying harder. And suddenly I felt tired instead of angry. Because betrayal ages everyone involved. Even the people causing it. A week later, Richard collapsed during a grocery store checkout line after experiencing chest pains. Minor heart episode, the doctor said. Stress-related. Melissa called me from the hospital because Sophie was crying uncontrollably. When I arrived, my granddaughter ran into my arms so hard she nearly knocked me backward. Then she looked up at me with swollen, frightened eyes and asked, "Are we still a family?" I held her tightly against my chest, while staring through the hospital hallway toward the room where Richard lay connected to heart monitors. And honestly, I didn't know how to answer. Hospitals after midnight all feel the same. Too bright. Too cold. Too quiet in the wrong ways. Sophie eventually fell asleep curled beside me in the waiting room with her small head resting against my shoulder, while old game shows played silently on a mounted television overhead. Melissa sat across from us looking emotionally shattered. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just exhausted in the way people look when consequences finally become real. Every so often she glanced toward the hallway leading to Richard's room, then toward Sophie, then down at her own trembling hands. Nobody had energy left for pretending anymore. Around 1 a.m, a nurse finally approached us. "He's asking for Evelyn." Melissa looked up first. Then Sophie. I stood slowly, my knees aching from hours in those uncomfortable plastic chairs. For a brief moment I considered refusing. After everything Richard had done, after the humiliation, after the lies, part of me wanted him to sit alone with his fear. But another part of me, the older part, the wiser part, understood something important. Punishment and peace are rarely the same thing. So I followed the nurse quietly down the hallway. Richard looked smaller in the hospital bed. Aging strips pried from people fast. The monitors beeped steadily beside him while rain tapped softly against the dark window near the corner of the room. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then finally he whispered, "I didn't think you'd come." I pulled a chair closer and sat carefully. "You're still Sophie's grandfather." His eyes watered immediately. That surprised me. Richard had never cried easily. Not even at funerals. But fear changes older men. Especially men who suddenly realize they're approaching the end of life without the people who once made them feel secure. "I messed everything up," he said hoarsely. I didn't answer. Because there wasn't really anything to say to that. He stared toward the ceiling. When I retired, he swallowed hard. I started feeling useless. There it was. Not lust. Not romance. Fear. The same fear Melissa described. Fear of aging. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of becoming invisible. "She made me feel young again," he admitted quietly. I closed my eyes briefly. How painfully ordinary. That's the tragedy of so many late-life betrayals. People expect evil masterminds. Most of the time it's just frightened aging adults making selfish decisions because they can't accept getting older. Richard continued speaking slowly between long pauses. "After Daniel died, everything changed." "Yes," I said softly, "it did. She needed help. She needed family," I corrected gently. He looked away. And for the first time in months I saw genuine shame instead of defensiveness. Not enough to erase the damage, but real. "I kept telling myself I deserved happiness too," he whispered. That sentence stayed suspended in the room for a long moment. Then I finally answered honestly. "You didn't destroy this family because you wanted happiness, Richard." He looked at me weakly. "You destroyed it because you stopped valuing loyalty." Tears slid quietly into his thinning gray hair. I had imagined this moment many times over the previous months. Imagined screaming. Imagined rage. Imagined satisfaction. Instead, I mostly felt sad. Sad for Daniel. Sad for Sophie. Sad for the younger versions of ourselves who once loved each other honestly before selfishness slowly replaced gratitude. Around 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock at the door. Melissa stepped carefully into the room. The tension changed immediately. She looked terrified. Not of me. Of herself. Richard stared at her silently. And suddenly the fantasy that once connected them looked completely dead. No excitement. No romance. Just two aging people sitting in the wreckage of terrible decisions. Melissa moved closer to the bed slowly. "You scared us," she whispered. Richard nodded faintly. Then nobody spoke. For almost a full minute. Finally, Melissa started crying quietly again. I don't even recognize myself anymore. Richard closed his eyes. I believed her. Because betrayal changes the betrayer too. It twists people into smaller versions of themselves. More selfish. More frightened. Less human. Melissa wiped her face shakily. "I betrayed Daniel," she whispered. "Sometimes I think about him every single night." That hit harder than I expected. Because despite everything I knew, Daniel would have hated what this family became. He was steady. Kind. Loyal. The type of man who fixed neighbors' fences without charging them. The type who remembered birthdays. The type who deserved better from all of us. "I can't forgive what you did," I told her honestly. Melissa nodded immediately. I know. But Sophie still deserves stability. Fresh tears rolled down her face. I know that too. And strangely enough, that conversation became the first honest moment our family had shared in years. No manipulation. No pretending. No fantasy. Just truth. Painful truth. A few weeks later, after Richard returned home from the hospital, I met with Linda again to finalize revisions to my estate planning. Not because I wanted revenge anymore. Because I wanted protection. Especially for Sophie. I established a protected educational trust in her name. Carefully structured. Money released gradually for college housing or medical emergencies later in life. Not luxury spending. Not manipulation. Not dependency. Responsibility. Linda reviewed the documents approvingly. You've thought this through. At my age, I said quietly, you start thinking less about punishment and more about what survives you. That became my guiding principle after everything. What survives us? Not money. Not pride. Not ego. Character. Stability. Memory. The emotional inheritance we leave behind for younger people. Richard called occasionally after leaving the hospital. Short conversations mostly. Updates about doctor visits. Questions about Sophie. Awkward silences. One evening near Thanksgiving, he said something that stayed with me. Thank you for coming that night. I stood at my kitchen window watching snow begin falling across the backyard. You would have done the same for me once I answered. The once hung heavily between us. Because that was the tragedy underneath everything else. Once upon a time, he probably would have. And maybe that's what aging teaches us if we're willing to learn. Love doesn't usually disappear all at once. It erodes slowly when gratitude disappears first. By December, Sophie started smiling more again. Sleeping better, too. One snowy evening, she sat beside me decorating Christmas cookies and suddenly asked, Grandma? Yes, sweetheart. Do broken families ever heal? I looked at her carefully. Then I answered the only honest way I could. Not perfectly, I said softly, but sometimes people can still learn how to love each other differently. She seemed to think about that for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and handed me another cookie to decorate. And for the first time in a very long while, the house finally felt warm again. A year after the divorce, I planted tomatoes again. That may not sound important to younger people, but at my age, planting something for next season is an act of faith. The previous spring, I could barely get out of bed some mornings. I wandered through my own life like a ghost carrying grocery bags. Now, standing in my backyard beneath soft Ohio sunlight with dirt on my gardening gloves and Sophie laughing nearby, I realized something surprising. I had survived. Not gracefully every day. Not perfectly. But honestly, the divorce finalized quietly that February. No dramatic courtroom battle. No public humiliation. Just signatures, paperwork, and two exhausted older people officially ending a marriage that had already died long before the legal process began. Richard kept the condo. I kept the house. And somehow neither of us truly won anything. That's the part revenge stories rarely admit. Even justified revenge leaves ashes behind. Melissa moved into a modest townhouse about 20 minutes away near Dublin. Smaller place, older neighborhood, nothing luxurious. For the first few months after everything collapsed, Sophie struggled with the transitions. Different routines. Different rules. Different versions of adults trying to rebuild themselves. But slowly life settled. Melissa found steady work managing billing for a dental office. Nothing glamorous. Which honestly turned out to be good for her. Routine grounded her again. Responsibility grounded her. Over time, she stopped chasing fantasies and started rebuilding trust through consistency instead. Picking Sophie up on time. Paying bills properly. Showing up honestly. The small, unexciting behaviors that actually hold families together. We were never close again the way we once were. That kind of trust does not regenerate at our age. But hostility softened. And eventually something gentler replaced it. Not forgiveness exactly. Understanding. There's a difference. Richard changed too. More than I expected. The arrogance disappeared almost entirely after the heart episode. Aging finally caught up with him emotionally. He started attending church again occasionally, volunteering twice a month at a veterans food pantry nearby. Not because he suddenly became a saint, because loneliness humbled him. That's another thing people over 60 understand better than younger generations. Sometimes consequences teach lessons pride never could. We spoke occasionally now. Mostly about Sophie. Sometimes about old memories. Never about reconciliation. That chapter was over. One afternoon in late October, Richard asked if I'd meet him at Green Lawn Cemetery. I almost said no. But something in his voice stopped me. So the following Sunday I drove there carrying fresh carnations for Daniel. The air smelled like fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. Richard stood beside Daniel's grave wearing an old brown coat I remembered buying him years ago during a winter clearance sale. He looked older than 71. Not physically fragile. Just emotionally worn. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then Richard quietly said, "I failed him." Simple words. No excuses attached. No self-pity. Just truth. I stared down at my son's headstone while cold wind moved through the cemetery trees. "Yes," I answered softly. Richard nodded as though he deserved nothing gentler. Tears filled his eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I know." He swallowed hard. "But I am sorry, Evelyn. For the first time since all of this began, I believed him completely. And strangely enough, that mattered. Not because apologies erase damage. They don't. But sincere remorse allows wounds to close instead of staying infected forever. I placed the carnations beside Daniel's grave carefully. Then I looked at the man I once planned to grow old beside. "We can't rebuild what we were," I said quietly. "I know. But Sophie still deserves peace." Richard nodded immediately. "She does." That became our final agreement. Not about money. Not about blame. About the child still watching us. After that day, something inside me finally loosened. Not forgetting. Never forgetting. But releasing. There's a difference there too. Because carrying hatred forever is exhausting work for an aging heart. And eventually you begin asking yourself an important question. How much of the life I still have left do I want to spend reliving pain? My answer surprised me. Not much. The following spring, Sophie performed in her school choir recital. Melissa sat on one side of me in the auditorium. Richard sat on the other. Awkward little family arrangement. A year earlier, the tension would have been unbearable. Now it simply felt bittersweet. Human. When Sophie walked onto the stage wearing a blue choir robe, she searched the audience nervously until she spotted all three of us together. Then she smiled. That smile alone made every painful conversation worth surviving. Because in the end, children do not need perfect families. They need emotionally honest adults who stop making them carry the weight of unresolved selfishness. After the recital, Sophie grabbed my hand while we walked through the school parking lot beneath cool evening air. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart." "Are you happy now?" I looked up at the darkening sky for a moment before answering. Happiness at my age no longer meant excitement, or romance, or even certainty. It meant peace. And yes, finally, I had peace. "I think I am," I told her softly. She squeezed my hand tighter. That night after everyone left, I sat alone on the back porch listening to spring crickets sing in the darkness. And I thought about everything this terrible year had taught me. Greed blinds people. Loneliness distorts judgment. And betrayal rarely begins in bedrooms. It begins the moment people stop appreciating the ones who quietly hold their lives together. But I also learned something else. Dignity matters. Patience matters. Understanding your legal rights matters. Especially for older women who spent decades sacrificing quietly while others took credit. Most importantly, I learned that revenge is only satisfying when it protects your self-respect instead of destroying your soul. As I watched porch lights glow across neighboring yards, I thought about Daniel, about Sophie, about all the broken pieces our family somehow managed to carry forward anyway. And I realized the money was never truly the point. Not really. The real battle was about refusing to disappear. About refusing to let betrayal define the final chapter of my life. Sophie ran across the yard chasing fireflies while laughter echoed softly through the warm Ohio night. And watching her, I finally understood something simple and true. In the end, the only thing worth protecting was never the money. It was the family we still had left. And if this story touched your heart in some way, if you've ever lived through betrayal grief or the slow rebuilding of trust later in life, I hope you'll remember this. Your dignity is never too old to defend. Your peace is never too late to reclaim. And sometimes surviving with kindness is the strongest revenge of all. Please share this story with someone who may need it, and stay a while for more stories about family resilience and second chances.